happening now. We'd like to welcome our viewers from across North America and around the world. This is the EdTech Situation Room, episode 194 for October the 14th, 2020. My name is Wes Fryer. I am here in Central Oklahoma wearing my UCO Bronchos t-shirt tonight because we've been to see volleyball, and we only have one child in college this year. It is better to only have one rather than two children in college at the same time. But even after they leave, you have some bills to pay. But we're not here to talk about that. I'm joined by the maestro of EdTech, who lives in an amazing valley surrounded by mountains, and he has a constant campfire going at his feet at all times to keep all the animals at bay. It's Dr. Jason Neiffer from Montana. And you look the part tonight, sir. Is that even flannel that you have on?
It is flannel, and in fact, I have declared it flannel season in Montana, which is very exciting because it's my favorite clothing. And I guess I do have a really kind of rugged, the big beard and the hair, and now the flannel shirt do give me a certain, what do they say, je ne sais quoi. So, yes, I am Jason Neiffer, and I am the assistant director and curriculum director of the Montana Digital Academy, which is Montana State Virtual School. And our offices, I'm not on campus right now, but are on the University of Montana campus, which is just down the street. And winter is coming. We have not had a hard freeze yet, but it's been raining for the last couple of days, and a cold October rain, and it's starting to smell. Well, actually, 2 weeks ago, it starts smelling like fall. Fall's got a very distinct scent, particularly in western Montana, but you can smell fall outside, and things are happening. I would guess snow hit 4,000 feet, I think, over the weekend. I think we're at 3,400 feet, so it's coming.
Yeah. Well, we had a fall break this last weekend, which was lovely. And today in Oklahoma City, it was supposed to get to 91 degrees Fahrenheit. Wow. When I asked Google Home when we got home, it was 89. So almost got that high. But we were in the mountains of New Mexico and got to go camping, which we did not do this summer. And we rented a trailer from RV Share and basically it was about a 12-hour drive because we took our time going out, maybe 10 hours coming back. But it was 22 degrees when we left our campsite on Monday morning and had to get some ice out of the dog's bowl. This was Moose, who turns 1 year old tomorrow, and his first time to go camping. And it was lovely. The high country, we were about 9,000 some feet, but even higher than that, the trees in some areas were just like no leaves, but we had lots of beautiful fall colors, and we will anticipate the arrival of fall here at some point, which normally by the end of October and Halloween time, maybe we'll get a freeze. So a little bit different. But tonight we are going to end our discussion of the weather. We were noting before the start of the show that the COVID peak or spike is upon us. So we did not have any available ICU beds yesterday in the Oklahoma City hospital system, according to somebody who was at our city council meeting and I read about. And Jason, you said one of your communities is like at 140%. Was that Great Falls? That was
Great Falls was well over capacity, and that's hospital wide, and it wouldn't be all COVID. It's a major regional center, major regional medical center as well. But yeah, it's certainly happening. And I know there was a New York Times article that was posted a couple hours back talking about that the rural western states are now kind of the epicenter of this, and Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, to a lesser extent, Wyoming, Idaho. I think I've seen a bit of a surge in Alaska. That's where this is happening now. So, I think most people did this to come back around, right, when wintertime came, and certainly, we're not over it yet. And I would say that rural western states are kind of seeing what some of the coastal states saw early on in the pandemic.
Yeah, well, this is the first time here in the Oklahoma City area that I've heard that we've gotten, to a capacity for hospitals. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to continue being at school in person. We went back on August 14th, and man, I had one of the best days probably ever teaching kids. We have been working on dialogue projects in fifth grade introductory Spanish, and so the kids had written dialogues in Spanish, and we'd use some vocabulary from it was a movie talk we had, and then we made puppet videos with finger puppets, and then in Scratch, they had already done a project where they had put the word bubbles in there, the speech bubbles, and this time they did those projects with a partner, but then they recorded their voices, and today was movie day, so we had the air popper,
Nice.
no butter, because that's not a good thing to mix with Chromebooks, but as good as they are, I don't think they mix well with butter. But we had movie day. We watched all the videos because they screencasted their Scratch project, so we could do that. And then, did a little feedback and had people talk about their lessons learned. It was joyful. So I hope that our spike in community COVID is not going to mean any mandates for schools, including ours, but time will tell. I hear there was some tech news and like some events and stuff this week. Jason, what are we going to talk about that? What do we do on this show?
Well, the EdTech Situation Room is a once weekly podcast where we take a look at the tech news and kind of shoot it through the educational lens to see if we can find some insight that might be useful to our fellow teachers, administrators, IT directors, and other folks that support students in education. And this week we have several topics. We obviously have some Apple news, Google news, something that we like to call the tech correction here on the podcast, privacy news, hardware news, our favorite topic, which is miscellaneous. And then at the end of tonight, we'll share a little interesting tidbit that we like to call the Geek of the Week. But I guess, Wes, yesterday, iPhone 12 is released, and I'm wondering if you have any initial quick impressions as kind of the podcast Apple aficionado.
Well, Moore's Law marches on, right? In all the discussions. I didn't watch the whole event, but of course, read some articles about some summaries. I got through part of the initial, actually all the HomePod Mini sections. It'll be interesting to see if Spotify is supported by the HomePod Mini. The HomePod Mini is $99. As we've talked about on the show, we're a Google family, with about 4 Google Home Minis and numerous smart plugs and all that. And so we're into that ecosystem. But it does look like a very sweet speaker. I had not, until I was reading about whether Spotify would be on there or not, realized that Spotify had filed, I think in March maybe, against Apple in the EU, and antitrust, our assertions of monopolistic behavior case. I don't know what the timeline for that is, but that's really the big thing for us is, there's a whole lot of things, and actually access to Google and how good Google is and how much Google knows our lives. All those things are pretty important. But I did hear in the iPhone section, that again, they've doubled the amount of pixels. And I don't know if that was for the Pro version, but when you continue to double things like speed and capabilities, it is just pretty astounding. The number one thing I'm interested in is 5G. And I think we talked about this maybe in the show either last week or the week before. I did drop an article in, I think I put it under miscellaneous because it's Verizon. I'll move it up to the Apple section, whatever, it doesn't matter. Verizon nationwide 5G ready for iPhone 12. Don't expect a big speed boost. And this was Ars Technica on October the 13th. And that was certainly a big deal that, this iPhone is going to support more, bands of 5G, but it's just early days. They have not rolled out the 5G network substantially. Verizon claims nationwide coverage, but according to a definition, the article says that's over 15 years old. That means you reach 200 million people in the United States, which you can do by, picking your largest cities and leaving the vast majority of the country geographically, out of the picture. The article also says, because I didn't know this, I've really just heard the speed predictions about theoretically, how fast this will be. And Apple talked about that. But this article gets into the details that, AT&T, when they rolled out their 5G, the PC Magazine did a lot of testing on this. Their 5G was actually slower than their 4G had been. There's differences in distance and penetration through, walls and structures and things like that. But they said that they're lighting up the 5G icon on these phones, and this is really a big marketing thing. It's not going to be that significant from a speed standpoint now, but down the road there is that potential. But they're going to also. This was interesting in the announcement. there's going to be more battery consumption when you are using a 5G connection. And so part of what Apple has designed the new iPhone 12 to do is when you don't need that additional speed to go down to 4G. And so Verizon is also right now using the same part of the spectrum of bandwidth that is used for 4G and LTE. So it's another phone, another day. Apple is late, as they sometimes are, to some technology competitions with the HomePod. I think the biggest thing is the artificial intelligence capability, and I have yet to see evidence either in my own life using Siri on my iPhone or reading things that Siri is something to be amazed and happy about. So there are some interesting, features with family collaboration and things like that, and intercom. But that's stuff we have with the Google Home now. So, Jason, I think I can be pretty confident that the HomePod Mini, at least, did not encourage you to ditch all Amazon and Google devices, throw them into the dumpster immediately, and place your order for a November shipment or whenever they're actually going to ship.
That's correct, and that was definitely the least compelling thing in my view of the things announced by Apple yesterday. I will say 5G is not. It's almost of no temptation to me at this point. And you made a really good point in last week's episode, Wes, that part of it is that it needs to be much more consistently available before it makes sense to upgrade to a device because of 5G. But I would take that one step further to say, I did look last week. I was able to find a website that talked about 5G availability by city. And apparently there is a 5G tower in Missoula. It is a T-Mobile 5G tower, so I would qualify for that. I would be able to utilize that, but there's one in the county, and that's just not enough consistency for me yet. And to be very frank, what you mentioned before in regards to when Verizon says nationwide is based on 200 million people availability, that leaves 133 million people out of that. And that's been part of my problem with 4G and 4G LTE implementation is that I think 5G is going to be a really special thing once it does have wide availability, but I would just like 4G and LTE to be more widely available. And again, I get that it is a better condition in urban areas, but I am in what might be described as a small town for someone that is kind of an easterly geographical influence. It's a town of 70,000 people that has a university and a young crowd that lives in town. And I would say that T-Mobile's pretty good, Verizon's pretty good, AT&T's pretty good here, but they're only pretty good because there's just not good coverage. And then you leave town and it gets, with the exception of the interstate, super spotty. So I'm not going to be if I happen to buy a device that has 5G, awesome. But for me personally, there's just nothing tempting in that yet. I do know from reading the coverage that the cameras in the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 12 mini are both dramatically improved once again. I did have someone cite a stat to me this morning that, and I don't know how you measure this, but like the nighttime camera features are like 80% better. I don't really know what that means, but how you quantify that. But
it means pretty awesome. I mean, our daughter has an 11 Pro, and it is amazing what it can do. We were camping and took some, shots, by firelight and by lantern light and whatever, and it's spectacular. That feature is really amazing. Well, and if it's 50% better, what is that? That's what I was going to say is that I think the iPhone is the leader in the night sight camera on the Google Pixel is pretty great too. But the bottom line is that's a really useful feature. I don't take enough photos to make a or to buy a new phone based on that. In fact, I think I have the Pixel 3a as my daily driver right now, and that has the same camera as the Pixel 4, which apparently was an outstanding camera. But the bottom line is that this is good enough for what I do with it. But yeah, I'll be curious to see when 12s get released and friends of mine are using them to hear back from it. I'll say that if anything's going to get me back in the Apple universe, it's the watch. And I'm not quite there yet. I'm still very happy-ish with my Google offerings there, but we shall see. Got an article to join to that, and then we can go a different direction if you like. This is a bandwidth article, so we're talking about 5G and how fast or not fast that might be. So I put this under the miscellaneous category. Ars Technica, October 8th. Comcast says gigabit downloads and uploads are now possible over cable. I don't think I did this one last week. This was a October 8th article. Do you remember me saying this?
No, that's no.
Okay. I'm over 50, so hey, things, just slip the mind. This is a huge deal. We're not on Comcast. We're on Cox here in Oklahoma City, but the maximum residential upload speed that we can get, and you can't give them more money for any more, is 35 gigabits per second. We have a theoretical 1,000 down, but you have to go with AT&T and their fiber, which is a symmetric 1,000 down, 1,000 up, which is also cheaper. It's like $70 or something like that a month for a gig up and down. So this announcement by Comcast is a really big deal. They also, like Cox, have been limiting their services residentially to a 35 megabit per second upload. So they it's not fiber to the actual, endpoint. It's still, or fiber, what is that called? Fiber to the node or something. It's basically fiber close to your house. The coaxial cable still provides the final home connection. And I don't know, I'm not a network engineer, obviously, but it seems like if you're going to be bringing data one direction at a certain speed, why would there not be a theoretical possibility of sending it the other direction, the same speed? And that's what this confirms, that it is possible. I'm going to be excited to see that become available. We are just a couple blocks too far west of the AT&T fiber internet service line. When we, at some point, and who knows, maybe this won't happen, but let's just say someday we are house hunting here or somewhere else. And by the way, we're not doing that right now. But at whatever point, internet speed is huge. And if I had the choice today to pick a home that was inside an AT&T service area for their fiber internet, that would weigh significantly on, the decision. I'm not saying we would make that. My wife would not allow me, I'm sure, to make that decision based solely on, the fact that internet speed can be there. But the promise of internet from the sky, from space and from satellite is continuing to hang in the air. The promise of 5G, and I'll throw that question to you, Jason. What should we do, seeing this future as we probably can, that it's just going to continue to get faster and faster? Does that have any implications for us in schools and in education when we think about the fact that we haven't reached the wall, where, that's it, no more speed for you?
Well, from one standpoint, that obviously we're starting to push more and more stuff over internet, right? So a lot of television video that used to come over cable wires is now, or over the air, is now coming over this piece. And we've mentioned a lot of articles, and they've been starting to come around again about how companies are starting to think about letting work at home folks be permanent and allowing opportunities for people to choose to work their home permanently. I mean, I like working at home, and I've enjoyed-ish working at home, since March 12th. But the downfall to me is I really also like to work at work, and I have a beautiful office on a beautiful campus in a beautiful town, and it's something that I miss. But one of the things that I don't have an issue with is that I have 400 down and 20 up as part of my cable connection. And that's about enough, I think, for two people working at home, that we never really have internet issues at home. But if you start thinking about what happens if it's a couple and two kids, that two kids are learning at home, let's say post-pandemic, they decide that they're going to stick with distance learning as a model, you're going to need increasing bandwidth to make that happen. And I've heard stories and read stories and accounts of people sharing internet connections as part of the stay-at-home orders that happened earlier this year, where there were 10, 12, 15 people sharing 30 down and 5 up, or 100 down and 5 up. And that's 100 down and 5 up, I would say, is not super great internet. I do know that, in fact, I have an example of this. That's my sister's internet in Salem, Oregon. It's a cable connection. It's 100 down. I'm sorry, it's 200 down and 5 up. And she wonders why during the day her Zoom calls aren't working out with her students, or her husband is a principal, and then her youngest daughter is taking Zoom classes via the high school, and it's just not enough. It's because 5 is not enough. Up bandwidth to be able to pull off multiple video calls. And so if more people are going to work at home, or if more traffic is going to go over the internet, then the expansion of bandwidth, I think, for home users is pretty important. That said, going back to an earlier point we made today, rural internet is a train wreck in the United States. It still is. And in fact, my in-laws, who live a 20-minute drive from the state capital in Montana, we're not talking about a completely remote area, they have no viable wired internet solution. They gave up a terrible DSL line 6 or so months ago to go mostly with wireless via cell phone coverage. And they were told it's so bad that the company that serves them told them that they wouldn't sell them the line back. We wouldn't set this up as a new customer, returning customer, because it's so terrible. We'll let you keep it, but if you get rid of it, it's never coming back. And that's, again, they live in a rural area, but it's, again, a 20-minute drive outside of the state capital, and that's the case. So I really hope that all of this, massive expansion of bandwidth in urban and suburban areas comes with a really real nationwide conversation about bandwidth for the masses.
Well, and here, you can touch on this idea of a tech correction and the need that we have. I will say, Wes will say, for regulation and some government intervention. I know that there are people that freaking flip out when you say that, like, oh, the government needs a law. But let's think about electrification, folks. Electrification would not have happened to rural America without cooperatives and without government action, because the return on investment is not there for companies. I worked for AT&T for 2 years, from 2006 to 2008. I had really interesting conversations with some executives about community Wi-Fi and why this wasn't happening and how we could do this. And part of the answer is return on investment. Is this going to be a cash cow for the company? I mean, that's how most corporations think. There are some exceptions to that in different, situations, but in general, it's about profitability. And so to get electricity to rural America, we had to have collaborative action that involved things like cooperatives and things like, legislation, the E-rate, I'm not thinking of the right laws, but basically, the mandates that we had for connectivity and also phone lines, right? That was how, we got phone lines everywhere. So I think that we have very important roles to look at government, and we can talk some more later in the show probably about tech correction and consumer protection and that kind of an analogy. But absolutely, I think we had an article maybe two shows ago, fairly recently, where, there are some studies that show during COVID, we've had an average increase in the broadband speed in several states. I know that Wyoming was one of those, and I think Kansas was one. But guess what? It was the action of state legislatures and governments that were acting on the part of residents that, in those cases, I think led to fiber build outs and expansions of service. And then you end up getting the last mile service to folks. So I am 100% with you. And I think that this is important advocacy, and nothing has dramatized it more than our present COVID pandemic, which makes access to the internet and the ability to work over an internet connection, literally a lifeline for all kinds of people, more people than ever before. Where shall we go next, sir?
Well, there are a lot of interesting articles this week on what we loosely refer to as the tech correction here on the podcast. And we started using this term in 2016, and it was largely a response to the perception that tech had led us down a bad road for the 2016 election. And as it turns out, we were talking about things like Cambridge Analytica, the pushback on services like Facebook in taking our private data and monetizing it and doing nefarious things with it. And I think there's a lot of interesting articles this week that could take us down some fascinating rabbit holes. So I guess I'd start off with we mentioned last week that the House of Representatives have released their antitrust report aimed at tech biggies, including Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. And there is an article that I would certainly recommend that you take a look at later from Wired about, they call it the 14 juiciest quotes around the antitrust report. But I wanted to dig into some things that have started to bubble up after that House report was released. And I'll give you an example of some of the stuff that's being talked about, not from a regulation standpoint, but as we start to dig more deeply into kind of how tech handled their massive growth and their huge potential of kind of wiggling their way in our lives. There's a great September 24th Ars Technica article that I think is kind of illustrative, right? So basically the article is called "Former Facebook Manager Says We Took a Page from Big Tobacco's Playbook." And the article talks a little bit about a congressional hearing that happened in September, where they're still trying to figure out, like, why is it that all these technologies were kind of wiggling their way into our lives, and then ultimately in things like elections. And they're the person that testified, his name was Tim Kendall. He was the director of monetization for Facebook for 4 pretty critical years, 2006 through 2010. And he talks a little bit about the notion that he talked about mining attention, and he said that we wanted to make ourselves addictive from the outset, so that no matter what happens down the road, people will continue to come back to the drug, right? Which would be, again, the big tobacco's thing, right? Catch someone early on in their formative years, addict them to smoking, and then you have a, lifelong, maybe a shortened life, but a lifelong user of the product. And the reason why that's interesting to me is that he talks about the increased levels of nicotine in tobacco and how that led to the notice or the addiction of tobacco. But he said we did a lot of the same thing because we allowed a lot of things to flourish on Facebook that we knew were potentially destructive, because we knew that was going to keep people's attention, right? Mining attention in the social media applications, figuring that once we had everyone kind of hooked, we could go back and clean it up later. And the reason why this article stuck so much with me is that I refer to it this way. I think we've talked about it this way, that it kind of feels like that the narrative that's been pushed most of this time is that people stumbled into these platforms trying to connect one another. It offered everyone the ability to publish to a worldwide audience, which is an interesting and incredibly powerful notion, right? Like, that you can do that. We talk about that a lot here, that's one of the reasons why we like technologies, because you can hand a 14-year-old kiddo a worldwide mic and give them an ability to publish to the world with its power of technology. But then, it got away from us, and now we need to figure out how to rein it back in. And if you take this testimony at its face, it appears that, well, at least Facebook, I can't speak for all social media companies, but Facebook, according to Mr. Kendall, actually was aware that there were pots of negative groups that were starting to descend upon Facebook, that misinformation was being spread on Facebook, that people were utilizing the platform to really speak to, the worst of the community of humanity in an attempt to get them to, a kind of feed off of each other to be then addicted to the platform. And this article stunned me because it really flipped around the narrative that I had in my head. And if it's true that Facebook knew that this was going to cause an issue, they just waited for it to implode on them before kind of dealing with it. I'm not sure if they've really done much in the last couple of years to evolve the product. Then, it's become tobacco then, and that's not good at all. So any comments or thoughts, Dr. Fryer?
Well, it's probably going to be difficult to try to ascertain that kind of intent and when did you know it. When you differentiate between misinformation and disinformation and malinformation, that also has to do with intent and a perception of intent. Whatever that reality is, or whatever that history was, the reality today is that we've got lots of destructive things happening because of these tools and the ways they've been allowed to evolve, and just the landscape. It's so polluted, but it's also so easily manipulated and even weaponized for malicious purposes.
Yep.
So we are going to, on November 10th at our school, be having a parent university conversation about the social dilemma, which I'm pretty excited about. I think our communications are going to start going out about that. In fact, I need to crowdsource some good discussion questions. We're going to do Zoom breakout rooms and invite parents to talk about this and discuss it. And man, we just have to, we need to get beyond. And I was thinking about this over the weekend, like, we're not a political show. We are not going to talk about the election much today. We'll talk about some articles that relate to it, but we intentionally steer clear of a lot of that. But I think that, and I'm actually preparing. I'm going to get to do another TEDx talk in the spring. It was originally going to be this fall, and it's been moved back. And it's about technology fear therapy. And I think I'm going to talk about individual levels, community level, and then this larger societal level. We really need to be gearing up and figuring out who we can support, what kinds of nonprofits, what kinds of organizations are going to advocate for the kinds of change we would like to see in these platforms. And because this is really big, right? When you're talking about companies that are as wealthy as Facebook and Amazon and Twitter and Apple, I mean, these are the largest companies from a financial standpoint in the entire world, as far as I know. Maybe Alibaba's up there, but I don't know. We'll have to ask. We'll have to Google that later. It's a big deal. So I think that I would like to know a little more, sort of in the same way that a teachers union, or in Texas, I mean, they weren't allowed to call them unions, so they were associations, but they would protect interests and they would have some practical help that you would have with insurance and things, but they would advocate on behalf of teachers, and they had an agenda that, as a teacher, you were supportive of. I think we need to find those kinds of organizations here, because just like the 2016 election, are we ever going to know the extent to which Cambridge Analytica and, the involvement of the Russians, played in the final outcome? I don't know. Are we going to learn who killed JFK? There's some things that are going to be difficult to find out definitively, but we can certainly look at the outcome of what happened and what is ongoing and see that some action needs to be taken. So that's a quest that kind of, beyond our news focus of this podcast. But as I've said before, one of the great things I enjoy so much about this is the chance to try to connect dots and process this, right? This is actually something we all, I believe, need, are opportunities to process change and connect dots, because we've got these articles and these different things that are happening, and then ask a so what question, and hopefully it's not, be afraid, be very afraid. There's a lot more to do than just be afraid about these things. So do you have a sense of whether is it EFF or who are groups that are advocating around this that you think have a policy agenda out there? Is it the Center for Humane Technology that was behind the social dilemma, or are there groups that we can identify that are really trying to advocate for some meaningful and constructive change that'll address these issues?
I am not aware of specifics, but I think the conversation is starting to become a little more nuanced in that I don't think like regulation, I think is an important option here, but I also think too that we need to compel these companies to start. Well, I think being more transparent is part of it, but I think secondarily acknowledge the problem, right? And and I could have dropped 25 articles in about announcements regarding in the next 2 or 3 weeks about elections, Twitter, Facebook.
We won't avoid talking about the election for sure.
Yeah, they're announcing policies in regards to, Facebook announced last week that that there's going to be no political advertising on November 3rd. Because they don't want Facebook to be a platform for trying to discourage people from voting because of a claim that someone has won or lost already, or claiming victory. And my guess is that if you believe the folks that believe that the election will not be decided, at least the federal presidential election will not be decided on November 3rd, it might take into the 4th or 5th before that happens. It would take one side or the other dominating that election to maybe make it a clear victor on November 3rd, but I could see Facebook extending its moratorium on ads for a couple of days if it ends up being a one-sided or not a one-sided election. But the bottom line is that it's probably much deeper in that, and I think big tech needs to figure out, if they don't figure it out, then someone has got to step in and do it for them. The EU has been doing this for, well, upwards of 20 years now, right? Like, it seems like they are much less afraid to regulate big tech. And in some cases, I have to say, I don't like their solutions. We've talked about the so-called right to be forgotten here. And in part because it's just such a bizarre thing, right? Like, I think it creates some really weird situations when it comes to what a modern internet might look like. But the bottom line is that there are models for regulating, so big tech's got to decide where they are in that spectrum.
Well, here is an article that ties to that. This is an Ars Technica article from today on the 14th of October. Twitter, Facebook face blowback after stopping circulation of New York Post story. So here we have a situation where the New York Post, which is not a garage, tabloid. I mean, that would be considered by most folks a mainstream media source, claimed to have some leaked emails from Hunter Biden's, laptop from a few years ago, and then advances a theory involving Biden and Biden Jr. and Biden Sr., with Russia, etc. And this is actually pretty extraordinary. And I think it's positive to see our platforms taking these kinds of steps. You talked about Facebook proactively thinking about, the day of the election and what they're going to do. By 9 a.m., maybe Eastern time, they had taken, Facebook had taken the action to limit the spread of this article. And then Twitter, it says 11 a.m. That's probably New York time. Twitter actually completely blocked it. So the term was reducing distribution. That wasn't banning it, but they said it, quote, deprecates how Facebook's algorithm amplifies content. Of course, and this has led to blowback and people, who already think that the platforms unfairly are biased against conservative voices. But it was a clear case, and then it was acted on rapidly by the platforms, of really shoddy journalism and basically disinformation. And they compare it at the top of the article. And I read this saying, we're not a political show. Of course, this touches on politics, but this was like what the Comey memo had done on the 2016 presidential election, suggesting a scandal. And so anyway, this was some pretty decisive action that was taken by Facebook as well as by Twitter. And I think this is very positive. Again, I will agree with you, Jason. I don't think that the steps that the platforms are going to take is going to be sufficient, but we certainly see them taking much more assertive, aggressive action against this kind of stuff in the 2020 election cycle than they did in 2016. And I think that is positive. So any thoughts about this? Did you see that article on your feed before it was deprecated by Facebook?
I did not, although I would say that I probably would scroll past a post article. So, the bottom line, it always goes back to, where do we draw that line, right? And in a way, that's kind of Mark Zuckerberg's argument. And so that makes this a little complicated. But, I tend to agree with the action that Twitter took and Twitter and Facebook took on that particular article. But then again, that things get complicated, right? Because that goes back to point of view. And, I don't believe that there's an anti-conservative bias in social media or Google for that matter. I really don't believe that. But at the same time, I also believe that it's just not as simple as it was 20 years ago, that search algorithms are going to try to push to the top of search engines, that social media is going to try to deliver you stuff that is the accurate or the stuff you really want to see. Instead, it's probably programming you more than you want to admit or you want to think about. And I think that's something we have to be aware of. And that's also also something, I mean, it goes back to, we've talked about this a couple of times in the past. This is one of the reasons why I don't like this notion that we don't need things like vetted resources anymore because we have Google, right? Or we don't need to teach history in classrooms because kids can just go Google it up. Well, I think history can be shockingly biased, right? And even though I tend to think that all history tends to have some bias to it, and that's from my mind as a historian. I was a history teacher when I was in the classroom. The bottom line is that if we send kids off with no tools, if we send kids off with no base, if we send kids off with no skills, then and just say, well, you can just Google that, so we don't need to teach that information to you. Who knows what they're subjected to?
We are seeding truth to the algorithm. That is exactly what we're doing at that point.
Exactly, right? And I think that that's really problematic. Now, let's ratchet this up a little bit because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one, Dr. Fryer. So, okay, so let's say that social media companies can't get it figured out, and at some point the government needs to step in. Well, that goes back to last week's House report about potential antitrust report or antitrust actions against things like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. Well, great article from Tech Radar that talks about a couple of the ideas being kicked around is forcing these companies to break up. And as an example of this, force Google to sell Chrome, force Google to sell Android, right? And I have to say, like, I just don't understand this, right? I understand that's a way to break these companies up, but other than breaking up the broader company, none of these products make sense outside the context of the companies that currently own them, right? So Chrome is a really good example of this. You sell Chrome off, right? Well then, okay, so what happens to Chrome OS, I guess, is the first question I have. Secondarily, part of the magic of Chrome, in my humble opinion, is the cloud sync of the device, right? That I can download a fresh Chrome browser on any computer, sign in, use my two-factor authentication because I'm good at security and safety, and then suddenly my Chrome browser pops up exactly how I left it, which is set up tweaked to be a productivity machine for the way I like to work, learn, and communicate, right? So if you sell Chrome off and it's its own thing, I don't know how it really profits enough to be successful long-term, right? We've talked about in the past that the only reason why Firefox is still financially viable in 2020 is because they get ad revenue from Google, right? So they've sold their main search engine spot. So I guess theoretically, Chrome could get money from Google, the search company, to continue to pay for. I don't know how that's really any different, but you lose the ability to sync based on a Google account because that then breaks that piece up. And I find some of these solutions to be completely bizarre. I understand how problematic it is to have vertical and horizontal trust in place, but I just think simply forcing companies to split up into smaller parts, especially in tech, I think is really problematic. Now, you could start to draw a little more of a clear conclusion under an Amazon scenario where they make Amazon sell off cloud services, which is hugely profitable, but also completely dominant in the market, away from retail sales, right? That makes ever so slightly more sense to me. But I think it goes back to, we've talked about this in the past, if we have to go to regulation, it's not going to be like a simple process. Like a lot of thought and effort's going to have to go into this to not completely decimate the tech processes that exist.
I will preface my response by saying this is very formative because I have not, committed tons of brain time to thinking about it. It's like debate. What's my plan? What's my policy change going to be? I am not favoring these kind of, let's just break them all up and solve it. I think we got to look at the impacts and effects that these things are having and look at behaviors. One of the things we're talking about theoretically is called network effects. This is an economic thing that happens where the big get bigger, and especially when you have a regulatory and political climate that is very amenable to business and corporations and just really doesn't have, there's not much pushback. You end up with these mega mergers, these huge companies, and, it's just very difficult if you're not a large company to be able to compete. And so we get widening rich poor gaps and problems with the economic distribution of wealth and all kinds of big things. So there are those issues to tackle. But I think the behavior of actors in terms of policing the kinds of abuses that are happening on their platforms, I think the issues with monopolistic behavior, I don't think. I mean, I love Apple, right? But the little bit I've read about the Spotify case, I mean, I don't think Apple should be able to, bludgeon its number one competitor, just because it can, for instance, and try to keep it off of its platforms or, use that kind of power in that way. I also don't think that we should say to Apple, you have to, there's the big case we don't have in the show notes this week, but with Fortnite and is it Epic Games, I think. Anyway, over the payment of the Apple tax and all those kind of things. There's a lot of issues to this, but when it specifically comes to, as we're thinking now about the climate of disinformation and misinformation, the political climate, the fact that we've got so many conspiracy theories, so much bad information that is being shared. And by bad, I'm not talking about things we disagree with politically. I'm talking about stuff that's just not backed up by good journalism and good research. Anyway, those are the things I'm thinking about the most, but it's a good question. And I think it's worth wrestling with some more because, hey, I don't know if you're running for election in 2024, Dr. Neiffer, but we need to have some very articulate and well-informed elected officials who are going to be helping bring about these kinds of changes. So podcasts, frankly, are a wonderful thing for democratic governance and informed citizenry. And I hope podcasts are going to continue to thrive because I think these kinds of conversations are hopefully they're not only beneficial for those of us that are, blessed to be in the room when it happens and be able to talk about it, but also those that can listen to it and possibly have their mind stimulated and maybe, action and behavior changed as a result. So I'm going to drop an article from the New York Times. This one is called How to Deal with a Crisis of Misinformation. This is from today as well by Brian Chen. And one of the things it's saying is we need to slow down. We need to be skeptical. They talk about being a fact checker. What I would say here is, the source first. If the source is a Fruit Loop source, it is not and just add Wikipedia. This was a media literacy lesson I just shared last week with my sixth graders. It's a great thing to put the word Wikipedia in a search query for the root domain of the website that you're getting. And if it is some kind of fringe outlier, not a source that appears to be trustworthy, like you don't even have to read anything else. You don't have to look at competing claims or anything else. You can just, discard it on the surface of, okay, this source is not going to be credible. But the article goes on to, in addition to that, say, we should be choosing our news carefully. We should be filtering that carefully. And I do think that the platforms, just like Google has with Google News in trying to really, have a channel of multiple perspectives, but mainstream media perspectives. I think that kind of filtering is valuable. But as you said, with politics, it gets complicated. There's a lot of weeds. And we have, folks who are not elected officials and they are not beholden to an elected school board or other board and organization that the voters can, vote up and down, who are making these kinds of decisions about the information that we are consuming and we are getting. So it is a challenging climate, but it is also one that, that needs you, educators. If you're out there listening, we need to be continuing to wave the flag and carry the torch of media literacy forward. And we also need to help inspire a new generation of students to understand these are challenges that we've got to face together and we need to figure out, right? We need to figure them out because I did not think I would live in an era, which I would say is a little bit like the 1930s with the rise of authoritarianism and the ways in which propaganda is being used to such, devastating effect. And we've got some serious challenges on our hands, and technology is intimately linked to all of those things that are happening.
Okay, right. Well, we just have 10 minutes left. So
oh my gosh.
I know it went quickly tonight. I know. There's a couple articles I'm gonna save for next week on privacy because I think they are also rabbit holes and things that I was shocked to read about this week that I thought I would share. I did want to share an interesting Ars Technica article just because the science is over my head, but this is from Ars Technica on October 11th. There's apparently a structure of black phosphorus that is a potential way to create a battery that would make battery recharging more like refueling, so almost instantaneous, as opposed to the slow charge that happens now. And this is the article even admits that this is out there. It could never make it back into any real battery technology. And I kind of feel like for the last 10, 12 years that there's been a lot of promises on battery technology that haven't necessarily come true. I know Apple was working on a new battery technology. I know Samsung was working on new battery technology. And obviously the batteries are good, right? I mean, the fact that we can get 24, I'm often able to get 48 hours on my Moto G8 power, which has got a big, thick battery, well, at least a big, thick battery comparison to a lot of the smaller phones, but it's still pretty svelte in comparison to batteries in 2005, 2007 on phones. But the interesting thing it noted in this battery was that they're talking about maybe 5 to 8 minutes completely recharging the battery from scratch, and that the battery itself would also have more longevity because it could go up to 2,000 cycles before degrading in quality. And I just think that would be really revolutionary about the way we charge our devices if you could plug it into a wall socket and have it completely go back to 100%, within 5-10 minutes, and would really be, I think, a real revolutionary process forward. And one assumes too that if that's also true with that, then things like electric cars could then become a much, much more palatable solution to our broader energy crisis.
The range anxiety issue, as we were thinking about this this weekend, as we tracked hundreds of miles west to New Mexico. I don't have an article about this, but there's some pretty interesting stuff on renewables and the projection for the percentage of renewables that are going to be taking up the energy matrix in the next 3 to 5 years. This stuff is really, really exciting. So I don't know that we're going to a net zero, the green deal, and exactly as fast as that is, but big improvements and important stuff. Let's hit a couple other miscellaneous real quick. I'm gonna go to a really great one, which amidst all the other news, like if I could put there's some certain political names that I would almost want my Google Home to just not mention. Don't do these. So sometimes it's hard to pick up these articles. Fantastic. New York Times from October 7th, Nobel Prize in Chemistry awarded to 2 scientists for work on genome editing. And these 2 scientists also happen to be women. And this was awarded for their 2012 work on CRISPR-Cas9, a method to edit DNA. We haven't, I don't think, done a lot of biotech articles lately, but we have in the past in the show. And this really is phenomenal work, and the ways in which this technology is continuing to advance, and the promise of that to be used as an incredible, healing technology for genetic disorders and genetic illnesses that people have. Of course, it's also going to pose a variety of issues for how it might be used in other ways that would be debatable as far as their benefit and their viability. But that is a great article to share. We probably don't, at least in my experience, amplify the fantastic work of female engineers, female scientists. Math anxiety is a real thing across gender lines, but we need to be amplifying the possibilities and potential, and I'll touch on this in the Geek of the Week, for young ladies as well as young men to make amazing contributions in these fields and to do things that are literally history changing. And I think that the CRISPR-Cas9 technology and that trajectory of genetic editing fits into that. And then here's a fun one, actually, Jason, you shared it, so we can see your response. This is not a new article. This is from July of 2019 from the Mac Observer. But at that point, which was a little over a year ago. iPhones have 100,000 times more processing power than Apollo 11. And this is one of those things that we've probably heard, different keynote speakers like Ian Jukes and Alan November rattle off about. Do you realize in your pocket, the computing power that you have? Why do you see that as significant? And what is that? Where does your mind go when you consider? I know that it may not be an iPhone, Jason, but the Android phone that you have, which has a comparable processor, is that much more powerful than Apollo 11.
Well, I mean, it goes back to, I was a geeky little kid, right? I had my little Atari 2600, and then my mom bought it was a K Pro 4 was the first computer in my home. It wasn't a Commodore 64. It wasn't an IBM PC. It was a K Pro, which was a CP/M-based machine. CP/M was a DOS-like operating system that was popular in business computing in the mid-1980s. And I cut my teeth on WordStar on CP/M K Pro, right? And I loved it. And I've been a nerd ever since, right? We then upgraded to a Tandy 1000, which was also kind of MS-DOS-like. And then I had my own computer in college. And then, I've been kind of a nerdy guy ever since. But, I always kind of felt that at some point this stuff would be infinitely more important because it kept getting more and more and more and more powerful. And I think some people thought the computer thing was niche, right? That it wouldn't be something in every home. And yet now everyone is carrying a phone in their pocket that is infinitely more powerful than the computers of the earlier days. And so I guess it's stunning, but at the same time, I think the nerds knew it was coming.
Yeah. And what are we doing with it? Are we doom scrolling through TikTok or Instagram?
Yeah.
Or, what are we doing? I think my dad may be watching, and I'll mention the Commodore 64 was our computer in 7th grade, learning to do BASIC, right? But Dad got a Zenith computer, and rather than Microsoft Office or whatever it was called, Works, we went with Framework. And so we had this integrated productivity package of word processing, database, and spreadsheet. And among other things, I ended up doing my Eagle Scout project, writing code in DBase 3 Plus for a time and talent survey for our church so they could more effectively get volunteer surveys and then find out exactly, who wants to usher and who wants to, help pick up, outside when we need to clean out the flower beds or whatever. So, it's those kinds of investments as that we've thought about our own kids. It's really amazing. Like I did not think that Alexander was going to be a college graduate working as a robotics engineer, supporting the International Space Station, and that coding was going to be this thing that he just gets. We had a conversation about that the other day. So you never know where this is going to go, and the chance to be able to empower, our own, relatives and family, but also students, not only with devices, but with the skills and that with some of that passion for what you can create, what you can make, and what you can do. This is a great day to do that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Wes, we're near the top of the hour here. Let me do a quick Geek of the Week, and then I'll toss it back to you. I saw an interesting article last week that impacted me so much that I did it. It's from Lifehacker on October 9th, and it said, it's time to audit your auto-pay subscriptions. And it noted some stunning statistics that many people have subscription services that they are having auto charged to their credit or debit card that they are not using anymore. And I know we had an article, this was probably 4 or 5 months ago, that companies like Netflix were actually going through and shutting down not accounts that weren't paying, accounts that were paying but were inactive. They didn't want the money. They said they would rather have their audience engaged, which I thought was very noble of them. But I decided to do that, and I sat down and looked at my credit card in the last month, and I found 2 subscriptions that I wasn't really using. And so $14 a month is coming back into my pocket because of that. So the article itself is really not more complex other than check your credit cards and debit cards to see if you have a subscription that you no longer need.
Let me ask you a follow-up from a past Geek of the Week. You were going to work on an iPod conversion project. Has that continued on, or is that on pause?
It did, and it's right here. This is an iPod Generation 4, which was kind of widely considered to be the best monochrome iPod before they moved towards the color and video iPods. It's I've not cleaned it up very much. I did break into it, and I replaced it with a 256 gigabyte SSD, and also put a new battery into it. So this is infinitely larger and lighter and better battery life than the original iPod. I believe this was a 20 gig. It's now got 256 gigs, so it can hold a very large amount of music. But I have to say, I absolutely love it. It's fun to use and very retro. And it does feel a little weird to listen to music and then not have a browser I can look at, so I can entertain myself in that way. But I have been really trying as much as possible to, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, disconnect from, the internet. And this is an awesome way to do that.
Sweet. I'll have to bring I've got the original click wheel iPod, and I'm telling you, man, when you had, what they say, 1,000 songs in your pocket, 5 gigs, just amazing. I don't know that thing is ever gonna, power again off of its FireWire connection, but pretty cool. Peggy George was saying she remembers using her Commodore 64 back in 1983.
Nice.
Back in the day. All right, so I have 2 Geeks of the Week. They are both AI related. The first one is something actually that I received via an unsolicited email today, which I usually am quick to delete, but this is a pretty phenomenal opportunity, and it's for high school students. It's by Stanford PhD students. The program is called AI Scholars 2020, a pre-college intensive in artificial intelligence, and both Stanford alumni and graduate students. They have in-person and live online for high school students globally. And man, just connecting with what we were just saying as far as inspiring the next generation, they've got in-person in Palo Alto, California, New York, Dubai, and India. And then the online, it is going to even be going over winter break. And then there's going to be summer sessions. And man, this just looks so cool. So if you know anybody that is at all interested in coding or might have aptitude in that area, being able to do something like this, which is a taste. Our daughter participated in a virtual debate camp, actually, and I'll admit this, although my dad will grit his teeth. It was at the University of Kansas, the Jayhawks, which are the arch rivals of the Kansas State Wildcats. But she had a fantastic, experience. In many ways, they just had a debate tournament 2 weeks ago, and there was anyway, it didn't run late, and there was some real benefit. We're hosting a tournament, virtual, but she'll be hosting it from here. So I would say don't undervalue the power of the virtual. We've talked about professional development and the outstanding things that Jason and I have been able to participate in, during this COVID time. And anyway, an awesome opportunity for students. And then lastly, this is an AI related one as well. This is a podcast recommendation, which this was actually suggested to me by Pocket Casts. Jason and I are both fans of Pocket Casts, which you can find on both the Android and the iOS platform. It is not the standard, Apple podcast app. This is from MIT Technology Review, and it is called In Machines We Trust. It is fantastic. It is by a journalist named Jennifer Strong. I've only listened to the first 3 episodes, but this is so important, this intersection of artificial intelligence with all these different aspects of our lives, and thinking about not only the choices we want to make for ourselves and for our homes, but also thinking about some bigger issues and what is happening with policing, and how is the early adoption of some of these technologies disproportionately affecting different people, because the data sets that were used to train these, guess what, we didn't have people of this ethnicity or people from this area, or enough women or men, or different kinds of things. And so very good podcast, and would definitely encourage people to check it out. So I think we probably better wrap up. Go ahead.
I did not go virtually, but I did attend the Jayhawk debate camp in 1991 as a high school debater.
Really? So there you go. So you owe at least a part of the debater and the thinker you are to the Jayhawks of Lawrence, Kansas. Good stuff.
Well, Wes, where can people find you on the internet?
W. Fryer on Twitter, speedofcreativity.org. I do promise to blog some more. I've fallen off the blogging wagon a bit, but I will get back on. And I'm continuing to share both Spanish curriculum as well as my media literacy lessons on mdtech.cassidy.org, which you can find in the show notes. How about you, Dr. Neiffer?
I am a Tech Savvy Teach, and I also work with the Northwest Council for Computer Education, blog.ncce.org. And a quick plug for their new continued series live at NCCE on Thursday afternoons. Check out their Twitter account, NCCE_EdTech.
We appreciate Peggy, and I think my father, who actually texted me during the show, for joining us live. I want to encourage anybody who can on a Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Mountain, whatever that is for you in your time zone, to join us live.
Excellent.
Oh, and this is my wrap up, isn't it? I was just ready to sit back. So yeah, so thanks everybody for joining. And we encourage you to check out all of our show notes on edtechsr.com. You can link to our Google Doc. We'll have some kind of clever title for this show, but we'll most importantly have all the reference links as well as the ability for you to download very small 32 kilobit audio versions and somewhat smaller compressed with Handbrake, I will say, downloaded from StreamYard, compressed with Handbrake, about 100 megabyte or so, which is pretty good for an hour-long show. Video versions, and you can always subscribe on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter at EdTechSR. Until next time, stay savvy, stay safe. Keep your mask on out there, folks. It's dangerous. And we'll hope to see you next week on the EdTech Situation Room.
Good night.